Well, I'd like to begin by thanking TESOL Academic Org for inviting me to talk about my work for about half an hour. I have a title which was actually suggested by them, which is Intercultural Communication, Implications for Practice. I've got a small audience here because I thought it might be a little bit easier for me if I was talking to other people than just the camera. It is quite hard to keep a presentation about one's work within such a short period, but I'm going to try my best. I'm going to start off with some of the origins and the trajectory of how I've come to be where I am at the moment in my work. And then I'll be more specific about the relationship between intercultural communication and English language education. And it's important to talk about this trajectory because I do feel that my thinking has developed over a long period of time as a result of the different places I've been to and the different things that I've done. My career in this respect began as an English language teacher in Iran in the early 1970s. I then spent 5 years in Syria and 5 years in Egypt. In each case I was a curriculum developer. And during that time I began to understand that things were absolutely as they seemed to be. And a particular area that I began to focus on was professional discourses. It was very clear to me that both as a teacher and later as a curriculum developer, there was a very powerful discourse which accompanied my work, which gave a distinct impression that I was somehow there to improve how things were in the places where I was working. There was a very powerful veneer of care and toleration that came from a Western perspective, and this is well catalogued now in literatures to do with aid work. And so I was accompanied in what I was doing by what later became clear to me as a very idealized Western individualism, and this was put into some sort of conflict with the demonizing of a non-Western collectivism. So it was very clear in various job descriptions that I had that I was there to liven things up and help the people I was working with to be more active. And this word active was often used. And because in these cultures people were often characterized as being collectivists and therefore somehow lacking in abilities to organize and plan and make things work and so on. And of course this was not true. And one only had to look beyond the professional discourse, which was very powerful, which was quite often the whole rationale for being there, and I was very keen to be a professional, but to look beyond this was to see that this wasn't the case at all. And actually, the reason I was there was not very well thought out. I then began to develop the notion of native speakerism as an ideology. And this became the topic of one of my earlier books called The Struggle to Teach English as an International Language, where I described this ideology as somehow not only people like me, but people all over the world were buying into the particular professional discourse which said that the native speaker, teacher of English, and the methodology of teaching was somehow superior. And this is still being bought into all over the world. There are parents in South Korea who prefer their students to be taught by a native speaker. And when they say native speaker, they're thinking of somebody with blonde hair and blue eyes. So somebody who was born and brought up in the United States with a Korean background, they don't count because their language isn't spoken by somebody with blonde hair and blue eyes. So then you see there's an element of race involved in these discourses. The issue with this is it's very hard to prove these things and pin them down. So what I began to do was to look more closely at various research methodologies that would help me to show that these things were the case. And so another book which I wrote, Doing and Writing Qualitative Research, the whole purpose for that was for me to explore and discover other ways of looking at the world, which were not at that time particularly predominant in my discipline. I then moved on to the nature of culture itself, because that was obviously an issue. These descriptions of individualism and collectivism are, in fact, types of cultural profiling that come from a particular paradigm, and they're quite complex and problematic because they're often used in a way in which it's implied that people from collectivist cultures are perfectly okay, but they're different to people from individualist cultures, but somehow they should be allowed to get on with their own deficiencies in their own way, and we shouldn't interfere with them. So this is the West saying that the rest of the world has the right to be whatever it wants to be. But somehow the whole thing is still skewed. And then I became very interested in the work of critical sociologists such as Stuart Hall and other colleagues who put themselves under the heading of critical cosmopolitanism, who were beginning to show that this apparent desire to construct an equality between cultures, a sort of cultural relativism, was actually the West trying to define the rest of the world. And when you began to read other people in this respect, in the area of TESOL, we began to discover that whenever people from collectivist cultures were being described, it was followed by negative adjectives. And that's been shown. In fact, the Japanese academic, and I'm particularly in favour of reading, is Ryoka Kubota, who showed that the descriptions of collectivist cultures are almost identical to the descriptions of underachieving white American school kids. So there was clearly a picture of deficiency there. And also, within the area of English language teaching, there were some very powerful discourses in place, very, very difficult to shake, very common, very dominant, and very easy notions. One is that one language represents one culture. Therefore, learning English means learning a particular culture. And within the context of what I've just been talking about, learning a Western language equals learning a superior culture, or at least an alienating culture. And so it's very clear to me that there are lots of language learners all over the world, possibly encouraged by their teachers, by their curricula, by the various ministries who produce curricula, all of whom are buying into these dominant discourses, who believe that when they learn English, they're having to learn something extremely alien, because English represents a Western culture, and if not only alien, somehow superior. And even if they don't believe it's superior, they feel cornered by the fact that it presents itself as superior. And this is very, very powerful. So to try to somehow counter this, I began to look for a different model of the nature of culture. And I actually went right back to my undergraduate days when I did my BSc in sociology, and I looked at the books that I was studying then, and I found that I had actually written notes in the margins of primary texts by people like Max Weber, and I began to look more closely at Max Weber's social action model of culture, and I developed my own version of this. It was somehow connected with things I wrote in the late 90s to do with small cultures, it seemed to me, from observation of life, that really, if we're talking about culture, we're talking about small-scale interaction between people around particular events. And I was very taken by something I read in a book by Spreadley on a very early text on qualitative research, where he describes an ethnographer who's interested in observing the behaviour around the drinks machine. And the culture is whatever happens amongst the people who happen to be there. So it can be both transient and fluid. It doesn't have to be a fixed thing. Then I began to read other people who talked about methodological nationalism, that there had been a huge push in the 19th century, especially in Europe, with the formation of nation states around ideals of culture and language, that this whole thing of one culture, one language, and cultures being easily definable and measurable in terms of different values was actually itself the product of a political discourse. So the way seemed open to look at things in a completely different way. So I began to develop this idea of social action from Max Weber, and I found myself, along with a group of colleagues in the area of intercultural communication, taking part in what I think is actually major paradigm change in the dominant views of what culture might be about. So in my last book, which was published last year, Intercultural Communication and Ideology, I actually take the ideas of Max Weber and I construct what I very audaciously label a grammar of culture. And what is interesting in this grammar is that it's extremely loose. I remember years ago, at the end of a conference presentation, talking to other delegates, there was a PhD student who came up to me and said, so how would you define culture? And I thought about it, and I thought, well, why do you have to? Isn't the problem that we've been trying to pin it down too much? And perhaps it's so complex that it's beyond the definition. I mean, I can actually show you, I don't know if you can see it on the camera. You can certainly see it on my website. This grammar is all over the place. And I'm very pleased that it's all over the place. There are bits and pieces of it that link together in complex, fluid ways. And it's very hard to put your finger on it. I've been working with this grammar now for several years. And a new book that's coming out shortly goes through the grammar in great detail and describes exactly how it operates. But I cannot escape from the complexity. And all the time, the complexity escapes easy definition and easy description. And I'm very pleased about that. What I found in looking at this is that right in the middle are two areas which have often been ignored in the dominant views about culture. One is personal trajectories. I interviewed about 30 or 40 people from all over the world by email, and I asked them a couple of leading questions. I asked them about their cultural identity and what they thought about nationality. And almost every single one talked about a personal journey from one place to another. And they talked about the way in which their cultural realities developed as this journey proceeded. As they met different people, as they had different jobs, as they moved from one country to another. And it was certainly a very fluid picture and very personal. Now, Max Weber makes a clear point that although we have massive national structures like education and politics and all sorts of things like that, the individual, given the opportunity, is free to dialogue with those. We've got to be very careful with this, because there are settings where the individual might not be free because of lacks of opportunity. So it certainly may be the case that students will say, in my education system, we are not free to discuss things in particular ways. That might be true. That doesn't mean that they can't think outside that box. And as soon as they leave that structure behind, of course, they can think and critique and dialogue just like anybody else. And I began to understand that the whole issue of things like critical thinking, thinking autonomously, thinking democratically, thinking individualistically, is actually a basic human trait. How far it's realised in certain contexts is to do with politics. It's not to do with the way in which people are wired by their cultures. Also, in the middle of this grammar, very, very powerful is what I've called underlying universal cultural processes. And by this I mean, this is the set of abilities all of us share to be able to read, understand and engage with culture wherever we find it. So whoever it is, if they approach a drinks machine and there are some other people there, they have the ability to work out some form of behaviour. It might not be conforming to the behaviour that's there already. It might be in absolute conflict with the behaviour that's there already. So whether you conform or you are in conflict, you're engaging with some sort of cultural reality. And so there's certainly an issue of conflict and discord in this picture. This must be the case. If it wasn't the case, whenever we travelled, we wouldn't have a hope of understanding anything at all. But in fact, we can make huge sense of what we find when we travel. And we might even make different sense and more sense to the people who are already there. And that indicates that we bring with us an ability to read culture wherever we find it. The idea of small culture, I began to develop a little bit further, and I suddenly came up with this idea of small culture on the go. Now, I've got a particular example I've been using in some of my presentations recently about a language learner who encounters a particular content in a textbook. In this textbook, which is produced by an international publisher, it has an element of so-called Western culture, and I say so-called because this is actually the interpretation of the people who wrote it, that people sit in a restaurant and at the end of the meal they split the bill. Well, one particular student finds this extremely difficult, and she says to herself, I'm sorry, if I have to split the bill in order to learn English, then this is very difficult for me. And this characterises the issue that some students have. The point is, as soon as she makes this comment and engages with this textbook, she is already creating a small cultural relationship with this textbook. She's already constructing culture between her and what's happening in this textbook. And that's small culture construction on the go. There was another case of somebody who visited their friend's family just down the street. And when they got there, they were very perturbed because these people weren't behaving in the same way as her family. And in fact, they were quite rude to her at one point because she didn't behave in the way that they liked her to behave. There was a huge amount of conflict there. Just in thinking about this and talking to someone else about it, she was constructing small culture between her and this event. She might never ever go back there again, but culture is already in the process of being formed. There's a trajectory which is engaging with new experience, and it's constructing and creating cultural experience as it goes. The other aspect of this, which is very problematic, is going back to this idea of discourses. Discourses of culture rely on the scripts that we have around us. And so, thinking about this student who encounters the textbook and doesn't like something in there, she has ready-made scripts available to her which help her to talk about the textbook in a particular way. She's heard from somewhere else that she belongs to a collectivist culture and these Western people belong to an individualist culture, so she uses that. She's heard from somewhere else that to learn English you have to learn Western culture, so she uses that. So the way in which she makes sense of this are actually already influenced by what other people think about these things around her, and that's very powerful. If you interview her and say, what do you think about this textbook, she will tell you, perhaps, this represents a Western culture, learning English means learning a Western culture, it alienates me, and that's how things are. She might not have ever thought about the possibility that there could be something else going on. So these discourses are very, very powerful, and they produce easy answers. And this is why, unfortunately, and this creates problems, we can't always take at face value what people tell us about who they are. There's a very nice piece of research carried out by a colleague of mine, Trevor Grimshaw, at the University of Bath, where he's talking about Chinese students in British universities. And he interviews these students, and they talk quite openly to him about why they feed their teachers with these cultural stereotypes. And they often do this in order to get bits of strategy and capital for themselves. It's an easy way out. They know this is what the teachers expect them to say, so they feed the information back again. And sometimes it can be an excuse, sometimes it can be a way of creating a bit of space, getting people off your back, and so forth. Just because they say this doesn't mean this is how things are. So I have this difficult problem to solve of how to navigate what people say, which is real to them, which is extremely important in how they construct their identity, but it might not actually necessarily describe what's going on. And this is quite a problematic area. Okay, so where does this take us in English language education? There's another student who also looks at the same textbook, and she approaches it in a completely different way. When she reads this narrative about these people splitting the bill, she thinks, well, actually, it does sound foreign, but there are things in my society where people do similar things. And she remembers when she was very young, she and her brothers and sisters were given household chores by their parents, and they had to split them up and share them. And suddenly she finds a connection between her own experience and what she finds in the textbook. At the same time, she knows that she doesn't always like the way that other people behave, but this doesn't change her life. She might resist having to split chores in her own home. She might resist the way that people behave in the family next door, but she can live with it. And so what she begins to say to herself is, well, my society is very complex. There are all sorts of things going on. Every day of my life, I have to negotiate cultural strangeness. So therefore, I can negotiate this textbook in the same way. And moreover, if I know that in my life, things are very complex, I mustn't take what's in this textbook at face value either. I have to understand that whoever has written this have their own views about what Western culture and language might be, but I am able to critique that. And I think this is the way that we need to move. So if you're in a classroom and one of your students says to you, I'm sorry, I don't like this content because it's Western and it doesn't suit me, don't take it at face value. Don't say, oh my God, yes, that's right. Sorry, we have to put up with it. Turn it into a positive learning possibility and redirect this student to their own society to find the resources which they can bring from their own background to make sense of the textbook. And here, I think, is the way through. So for language learners, the best resource in encountering cultural things in the learning of English is their existing cultural experience. And this actually mirrors what we say about communicative competence. We do say in our better moments that the best resource we have for learning a new language is our existing communicative competence in our existing language. And I think that's very important. So we're in the business of carrying experience from one place to another. And the more experience we have that is different and even in conflict to what we find, the greater capital that will give us in enabling us to manipulate these things. Okay. What then begins to happen is that you begin to understand what lots of people are saying in applied linguistics, that English doesn't belong to particular Western cultures. English is all over the world. And as a language, it can attach itself to whatever cultural reality there is. And this means that the language student has the ability, bringing their cultural stuff with them, to colonize the language, to stamp it, and make it their own. And I'm very interested in what Clemente and Higgins in the University of Oaxaca in Mexico said about the students that they interviewed in an ethnographic study of what sense they made of this foreign English language. And somebody said, well, you have to resist it in order to learn it. And unless you resist it, you can't really make it your own. But to resist it, you have to have a huge amount of stuff you can bring with you and take into it. So what I'm concerned about, what I'm interested in, is travel and innovation, cultural fluidity and change, and claiming the world. And what I mean by that is that language students, like anybody else, are actually cultural travellers. And when you travel, the more places you visit, the richer the picture it gives you. And this means that if you end up as an international student, in inverted commas, in a British university, you've got a huge experience that actually puts you ahead of the people who haven't been to the places that you've been to. What this also means is that you have it in your power to take some sort of action to actually change the cultural practices around you. And here I'm interested in the work of Gérard Delanty, who talks about cultural contestation. We mustn't be frightened of culture change and changing culture wherever we find it. And in terms of claiming the world, if we can somehow encourage our language learners to give a higher value to the cultural experience they bring with them, then this begins to undo these awful dominant discourses that undervalue it. There's no way on earth we can say that a language learner needs to learn a superior culture. What a language learner is able to do is to bring the massive cultural resource that they have already and bring it into the learning of English. And I think that's probably where I'm going to finish. Thank you very much.